Well, it's 10:01, so we might get this started. Welcome everyone to our on hold session. This morning we've got Tom Noonan, who is correct me if I'm wrong with any of this, Tom. Tom's the director of the Tandem program with UPT.
That's correct, yes.
Yep, that's right. Tom has got a myriad of instructor, rigging, and probably outside of skydiving ratings too, which I'm not aware of. Tom's an advocate for continuous education in skydiving. He travels the world, talking to people, teaching people, educating people, sharing stories, sharing information, all that kind of stuff. A real wealth of knowledge. I'm guessing that Tom also likes to have fun as well, so that's why we're here today to talk about not that the other stuff's not fun, but we're going to talk about skydiving in extreme conditions. So, Tom, I believe you hold a world record for the highest parachute landing ever or something like that. Is that right?
So my teammate, Paul Henry DeBar, he and I have been working together for about 10 years now as part of Everest Skydive. And originally, Wendy Smith and myself had set a record back in 2009 for the world's highest parachute landing at 17,200 feet or so. And then fast forward to this past year, so it's about 10, 11 years later, I had the opportunity to present my teammate with an opportunity to land at 20,200 feet, give or take. So we did set the world's highest landing last May, May of 2019, at the west call of a peak in Nepal called Barunse, and it was an ice ledge. It was pretty extreme, and an extraordinary experience. And yeah, so Paul Henry, or PH as he's known throughout the industry, he set that record in May of 19.
Awesome. Must have been cold and fast.
You know, believe it or not, it's probably one of the most remote locations that we've ever actually worked out of. And the location itself was quite cold for the landing. However, with the sun up and where we were operating out of, we were in shorts and t-shirts at our base camp. And it was all helicopter driven. We had to fly into the mountains, create a small base camp at about 17,800 feet. I was left by myself for about an hour on this dried up lake bed while the helicopter pilot and our ground crew of professional climbers went up to the west call of Barunse and awaited PH's arrival. So it was a pretty awesome experience, but it was definitely lonely up at 17,800 feet all by myself in a dried up lake bed with nothing but an oxygen mask and a cylinder to keep me company.
Very good. All right, we'll get this show on the road. Just a note to everyone that Tom's got a slideshow that he's going to share his screen with us with. So to see the slideshow, you'll need a laptop or a computer. You probably won't be able to see it on a mobile device, but that's not to say you won't be able to listen to the conversation. You have to be on gallery view. If no one knows how to do that, just send me a quick chat and I can talk you through it. And with that, Tom, over to you.
Well, thank you, Wade. I'm admittedly a novice when it comes to Zoom, so I'm going to try to show a couple of videos, show the PowerPoint presentation, talk throughout it. But if it's a little choppy or cut and paste, I apologize. I don't have a lot of experience with Zoom, but hopefully this will be a good opportunity for me to get better at it. I'm going to start by sending you or showing a video if I can. I'm going to share my screen, share computer audio, and this should bring me to my desktop. Okay, can you guys see my desktop?
Yep.
Okay. This will be a good audio video test. Did that come through, audio and video? Can you hear that and see it?
I can see it. I think the audio's, I'm not getting audio.
All right, so that was the first video that I wanted to show you guys. That was a jump onto the North Pole. And again, Wade, just to reconfirm, you were able to see the video, but not the audio. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. That's what I could see. I don't know if anyone else had any difference, but a couple of people said they can't hear anything. So,
all right.
The audio, the video was good. Yeah.
Okay, I've got a handful of small videos. They're 2 to 3 minutes that I'm going to show throughout this process. I'll stop and start the share again for the next video that I run. It is allowing audio from the computer, but for some reason it doesn't seem to be going through the Zoom. So for that, I apologize. The reason why I wanted to start with that video was that it's a great representation of a lot of the things we didn't know about extreme condition skydiving that we kind of learned the hard way. That jump on the North Pole was a tandem jump with myself and my teammate, and we had never really jumped in truly cold conditions before. So our jumpsuit selection was the same jumpsuits that we were using in Nepal, where we had jumped. We originally were exiting Nepal at 30,000 feet, where it was approximately -40 Celsius, and we had jumpsuits that were fleece lined that were more than adequate for the jumps that we were making. And we just naturally assumed that those jumpsuits would be fine for the North Pole as well. And the difference between the two, and what led that to be a quite cold experience on that North Pole jump, was that in Nepal, where we were operating out of was, again, probably 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which I think is somewhere in the teens, or 20 degrees Celsius. We were in shorts and t-shirts on the ground prior to making our jumps in Nepal. So we were warm essentially up until the point where we got into the helicopter or the aircraft to make the jump. Whereas on the North Pole, we were subjected to cold conditions for the better part of 2.5 days. There was no place to hide from the cold other than inside your tents. So in the North Pole, we actually found that we were getting quite cold on the ground, incredibly cold in the Mi-8 helicopter. It was actually, I think, colder in the helicopter than it was outside of the helicopter when we jumped. So in retrospect, we really didn't have the right jumpsuits for the conditions that we were working in. The conditions for the jump, they were perfectly acceptable, but the jump was only about 15 minutes of a 2-day expedition up to Ice Base Borneo. So that got us thinking long-term about the big picture of the location we're going to. It's not just the actual jump that you need to be able to operate around, it's the conditions that you're working in and living in throughout the journey to get there, make the jump, and leave. And if you can see the photo here on my desktop, this is actually from Antarctica 2 or 3 years later, where we're on a blue ice glacier and the winds are howling at 40 to 50 miles per hour, picking up the snow. But it was much warmer because we had the right gear on. We had, on the ground, we had warm weather gear so that we weren't cold while we were going through all of our operating procedures, while we were trying to determine the operational parameters of the jumps we were making. So just a little lesson learned from my perspective on everything I'm going to talk about for the next 45 to 50 minutes or so. They're just bits and pieces of information that I've picked up along the way. Successes that we've had in decision making, as well as the mistakes that we've made along the way. So I'm going to start my PowerPoint presentation. So if I had to pick a location where I fell in love with extreme condition skydiving, it would have to be in the Nepali Himalaya as part of Everest Skydive. I'm sure many of you know Wendy Smith. She and I have been blessed to be a part of Everest Skydive for 12 going on 13 years now. And we've been up there in excess of 15 or 16 times. We've done a number of different projects up there. And this is probably one of my favorite photos that has ever been taken in my skydiving career. Wendy took this photo back in 2010. That's Mount Everest right off my left hand there. And our exit altitude was 29,900 feet. We were just above Mount Everest peak as we were running our jump run beside it back towards our landing area. And we had on those fleece line jumpsuits, 1 or 2 light layers underneath. You can see in the picture, I'm actually wearing sneakers. I'm wearing just Vans sneakers. And the reason we were able to do that was that we weren't subjected to cold conditions for very long. Effectively like walking into a freezer to get a case of beer or a carton of beer. It was that cold, but only that cold for a few minutes. So we learned early on that we needed to prepare not just for the extreme cold conditions we were going to subject ourselves to on the skydive, but also wanting to be comfortable for the ride to altitude in a relatively warm aircraft. You don't want to have too many layers on and start sweating, because then when you leave the aircraft and you've sweat through your jumpsuit, it gets cold and makes it very uncomfortable and a little damp. So this is one of my favorite quotes. I've applied it to skydiving. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. I apply this to expedition skydiving and extreme condition skydiving because it really is a different path in skydiving than traditional, say, relative work, free flying, even now canopy piloting. All of these other wonderful disciplines are very mass oriented. And what I mean by that is that it's amazing to see canopy competitions around the world. It's amazing to see national and world FS competitions and wingsuit competitions, large volumes of extraordinary skydivers around the world competing and doing extraordinary things. But you don't tend to see that volume in these extreme condition skydiving expeditions, simply because the landscapes and the operational capacities typically don't support large volume. For example, in our Everest expeditions, we typically only work with about 5 to 10 skydivers per year, because our environment doesn't allow for us to bring 100 skydivers with us or 200 skydivers. The weather doesn't cooperate. The availability of aircraft wouldn't cooperate. So these are very small paths that we travel on when we go to these remote locations. So I've always liked the idea of going off the beaten path and getting lost in the world and finding these remote extreme locations to skydive in. And that's really been a passion of mine for the last 15 years or so. pretty much since 2008, actually, when Wendy and I first joined Everest Skydive. So just a quick little background on me. I'm the Tandem Program Director for United Parachute Technologies. My teammate PH and I, we actually own a company called Skydive Earth, where we take people around the world on these unique and hopefully extraordinary skydiving experiences. This last year, we were blessed to be able to jump on all 7 continents in 1 year. It took us about 7 months, including Antarctica. I've jumped in over 20 countries and I've seen a lot of the world that way. And in addition, when I have time, I organize, as well as PH organizing in Europe, we organize Halo skydiving events at local drop zones. Like to share the opportunities we have and experience with the people we work with. So when you're thinking about skydiving in extreme conditions, there's a handful of things we need to consider. Ultimately, where are we going? Because that's going to dictate the temperature criteria, whether we're going somewhere warm or somewhere cold. I included the idea of insurance because insurance is something skydivers in the United States, at least in my experience, we haven't really evolved into the idea of traveling with insurance. For 15 years, I traveled without insurance because I didn't really think it was A, available, or B, even necessary, until I started realizing that friends were getting injured overseas and then having to get back home, getting proper medical care while overseas. So I added a little section on insurance, which we'll cover. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about gear considerations, the things that we look at in really cold weather skydiving and even in warm weather skydiving. Aircraft considerations, the landing area, what to do in case of an emergency. There's certain extreme condition media considerations, how to capture your media and not lose it. Talk about that. And then I'll offer some conclusions. So first off, location, location, location. Where in the world are we going? If we're going north or south, is it going to be cold? And if it's going to be cold, how cold is it? What type of equipment do we need to jump in truly cold scenarios? If we're going to jump in warm weather locations, there's a lot of extreme conditions on or around the equator. I think the most famous one, from my perspective, is the Blue Hole skydive in Belize. Rich Grimm from Tsunami Skydivers, he organizes jumps into the Blue Hole. So you're actually jumping 50 miles offshore into the ocean, into that natural sinkhole, the Blue Hole. So water considerations there. So is it warm? Is it cold? What altitude are we landing at? Are we landing at sea level or in the sea? Are we landing at 15,000 feet, 19,000 feet? What are the different considerations that we need to determine before we go? And what are those challenges that these considerations are going to present? And I've always been an advocate of brainstorming, of thinking things through. One of my traditions in these expeditions is I sit in my office and I just close my eyes and I think about what can go wrong, what can go right, and what do I need to ensure that the majority of my decisions are leading towards things going right, as opposed to what's going to go wrong. And I'll give you a basic example of this, an admission of something I learned over the years. For the first 2 to 3 years we were up in the Himalaya, we didn't have wind meters. We didn't know what the winds were. Now, as experienced skydivers, we knew high winds versus low winds, but we didn't necessarily know, is it 12 miles an hour or 15 miles an hour or 10 miles an hour? And that brainstorm after our second or third event, realizing it's probably good information to have, not just the wind direction, but the actual wind speeds for our equipment decisions. So we went out and got, I think they're called anemometers. We got anemometers for our future expeditions. So looking at insurance. Insurance is that one thing that you never think of until you need it. And for skydivers, especially international skydivers, there are many options for skydiving insurance. I think one of the most popular ones in the world is Bupa. And unfortunately, they stopped insuring American citizens overseas. So as a result, US skydivers are left with World Nomads and Roam-Rite. Interestingly enough, in terms of age, once a skydiver has reached the age of 70, World Nomads will no longer offer insurance as well, so that leaves only Roam-Rite. But thankfully, Roam-Rite does continue to insure skydivers above the age, and I apologize, it's 72. Once you've reached or exceeded 72, Roam-Rite is your insurance option. So the insurance that we're looking for is travel insurance to protect our equipment, protect the trip being canceled due to factors beyond our control. medical insurance to make sure if you do get injured overseas that you have medical insurance to be able to get the best treatment possible. Evacuation insurance, in case you are injured in a remote location, are you able to be removed from the location you were injured? I'll give you an example of this. In Nepal, the Himalaya has helicopter service for a number of different things, whether it's bringing supplies up the mountain, whether it's bringing tourists on sightseeing flights. These same helicopters that retrieve climbers that are stuck or lost or sick, when they become med flights, when they have to bring a climber, or in our case, even a skydiver, down off the mountain that has been injured or is sick from altitude sickness, that $5,000 flight becomes a $50,000 flight when the helicopter becomes an air ambulance, because they're under different insurance requirements when they're transporting sick and injured people. The literally same flight path of that same helicopter goes from $5,000 to $50,000 in an instant. So having medical insurance to be able to evacuate in that unlikely scenario. And for us, our example is this: we don't expect someone to get injured based on all of the risk mitigation procedures that we have in place. But the one thing that we can't insure for everyone is altitude sickness. 99.99% of people will be mildly symptomatic of altitude sickness. But if someone is becoming altitude sick for reasons we can't control, the physiology of the human body, being able to fly them out of the mountain on that $50,000 med flight versus having to walk them out of the mountain over a 2 to 3 day period, the difference of that is about $130 medical insurance through World Nomads or Bupa or Roamrite. So all of our guests are encouraged to take this skydiving insurance that includes evacuation medical insurance, so that they're not stuck with a bill for $50,000 in the unlikely event that they're develop symptoms and become sick on the trip. So my next slide in terms of extreme conditions is what I call my floor plan. My floor plan is I take all the gear I think I need and I throw it out on the floor and look at it. And I pace around it. I look to think, what am I missing? What are the things that I have not put in this gear list? Something that I thought I might have thought I needed or forgot, or simply didn't think to put with my equipment. So I found that visualization when it comes to equipment is the easiest and best way to ensure that you don't miss something. Put everything out scattered on the floor and then take time to walk around it, visualize what you see, and then the flaws in your process, the things you've missed, will become more and more visible. It's so much easier to see when it's all laid out together. It's also important to have a checklist. There's the wind meter. Having a checklist of the things you need based on the conditions that you are operating in will help you ensure that you have everything you need for that trip. And the interesting thing about checklists is this: it's something I've learned over the years. I've gone to Antarctica twice now. I have 2 separate checklists. I have checklist number 1 that I made before the first trip. And after my first trip, I went back and I brainstormed, what did I miss? What did I take that was unnecessary? And I created checklist number 2 for my second trip. If the economy, if the world travel, if good luck is with us, we will be back again in December. And when I go back to Antarctica again in December, we will have a third checklist. So the key point here with checklists is they should always be evolving. You will learn things you need that you didn't bring with you, add them to the next checklist, and you will also take things that may be unnecessary that you could remove from the next checklist. So it's basically checklist currency. Skydivers are really good at currency, so it's just one more thing in extreme condition skydiving, making sure you have a current checklist. And that checklist includes your skydiving equipment, your clothing, and then, as I said, the brainstorm. I call it the X Factor brainstorm. What am I missing? What am I forgetting on this trip? And admittedly, returning to Nepal is my primary experience in this. I forget headlamps even with my checklists. And the reason why I forget my headlamps is because of iPhones. Because now an iPhone has a flashlight feature that effectively takes away the need for headlamps, unless your iPhone batteries are down and you can't use them for your headlamps. So despite the fact that the iPhones do allow for flashlights, we still carry headlamps for when the batteries are dying on the iPhones. Certain locations we need GPS watches so we know what altitude we're landing at. There's a couple of great companies that make GPS watches, Garmin being one of them. and Suunto are the other. Those are the two affordable altimeter watches that we use with GPS that give us the elevations we're operating out of. So what I'm going to do now is just show you some photos of some of the gear. I think I have one of the most well-rounded gear closets in skydiving at the moment, based on all the different places I've gone to. And I'm just going to kind of show you what's in my gear closet. These boots on the left, those are Baffin boots. They are rated down to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about minus 40 Celsius. I think they meet about minus 42. So for ultra cold weather skydiving, having an insulated boot in Baffin was a great choice for me. I was able to walk around on them on the ice floe, on the ice packs, and skydive in them without any issues. We also had Baffin minus 40 degree gloves for on the ground. I chose not to use those on the jump, however. I'm not a big fan of mittens when I'm skydiving. And the fact that I don't have access to all my fingers when I may need them for small items like RSLs or cutaway handles or reserve handles, the idea of skydiving with a mitten is not something that I'm particularly fond of. So I would wear those on the ground. My tandem passengers can wear them, but I tend not to skydive in them. Baffin boots are great for skydiving. The Baffin gloves, not so much. And over here, you see another set of gloves. This is another really good glove for cold weather skydiving. It's called Heat, and they're called Heat 3. They're effectively mittens, but they have zippers so that you can unzip the fingers, and there's actually fingers available to you if you need to grab small items. This jumpsuit combination here is my coldest weather combination. We were fortunate enough to work on a project taking a tandem pair up to 37,000 feet in Poland this last October. My teammate Jim and Maya set a tandem world record of exiting a hot air balloon from 37,000 feet. It was the tandem altitude record. And that was an incredibly cold program to run because they were in a hot air balloon in freezing conditions for over an hour and a half as they ascended to their jump altitude. And if we go back to the jumpsuits that I referenced for Everest Skydive and the jumpsuit you saw in the video, those would have been perfectly acceptable for that skydive had they been in an aircraft, had they had a 45-minute climb to altitude in a closed fuselage and only open the door to exit and fall down to earth. But because they were exposed to the elements below freezing for over an hour and a half as the balloon was climbing, we used a very, what I would consider radical jumpsuit combination that was incredibly effective. The underlayer in green is Carhartt upper and lower fleece, not fleece, the feather-lined jacket and down feather-lined jacket and pants. That was our underlayer. And on the right was a heavy-duty jumpsuit. The company is called Deem, D-E-E-M, Deem Flywear, I believe it is. They made these heavy-duty suits for us that allowed for the down suit to fit comfortably underneath it. It wasn't too restrictive. So between the Carhartt under and the Deem exterior jumpsuit, the layering of these suits allowed for the team to stay warm throughout the hour and a half ascent up in the balloon. I did the practice jumps for this in September. We went to about 29,000 feet, and it was incredibly cold. It was September in Poland, so it was incredibly cold at that altitude at that time of year. But with that suit combination, it was like standing on a beach. It was warm and comfortable without being sweaty. And most importantly, it allowed for movement. And that's probably one of the most dangerous things that we see in extreme conditions skydiving. So I know I've talked a lot. I'm going to stop after this slide and show you guys another video so you can see some more visuals. But one of the most dangerous things with extreme sports skydiving, especially in cold weather, is that we think about getting as warm as we can. How many layers can we put on? Jackets, pants, finger gloves, mittens. And then we fail to ask ourselves, is this going to hinder our ability to perform? Are we going to have so many layers on that we can't arch in a neutral boxman position? Are we going to have so many layers on that our view is obstructed? We're unable to see things underneath us. If you have too many neck gaiters or too many buffs on, is it going to affect our vision? And so making sure that you have just enough equipment to stay warm to do the job and not overloading yourself with too many layers of clothing so that your performance deteriorates. That's an important part of trying to determine how much to wear and based on the conditions you're operating in. I'm going to try to end the show. Okay, show is ended. I'll do a quick video here. And let me stop share. I'm going to stop share and reshare again and see if the audio works. Share computer sound. Optimize for full screen video clip. Zoom preferences. Audio. Let's try that and see if this is any better. Any audio on this one? Can you hear it?
Yeah, you can hear that.
So this is our team arriving in Kathmandu back in 2017. I'm going to fast forward to the actual skydiving component. This is actually a long video. I don't want to take up too much of your time with one video. So here we are at 13,000 feet, and we're preparing our drop zone in the Himalaya. And we're having all of our gear blessed. I apologize. I just paused that for a moment. Am I still with you? Hello?
Yep, you're still here.
Okay, so I just got a text message from my boss about something work related, and it said, keep this confidential. So my apologies. We're still working after hours here. So I'm gonna go back to sharing again. But you were able to hear the audio this time, and you can still hear me?
Yep, that's fine. Yeah, it's working well. Yep.
Wonderful. All right, let me get back to, let me do that again. I apologize for the interruption. Okay. Okay.
awesome.
Awesome, awesome.
Amazing views.
One of our best rides yet.
So I wanted to show that video during this presentation for a couple of reasons. One is that Everest Skydive, as I mentioned earlier, was the origination for Wendy, myself, and others towards heading into this extreme condition skydiving. And we learned so much about it. And in that one environment, we were exposed to a number of different extreme conditions. The extreme conditions being the altitudes we were working with, the temperatures at altitudes, as I'm sure you saw in the video, the terrain that we were landing in, uneven rocks, peculiar landing area, and there were multiple distractions of, there were multiple turbulent creating ridges and mountains, ridges and homes and things like that to avoid. So the entirety of that project, every aspect of it was extreme. And over the years, we learned as we got better and better at performing in that environment. So for comparison though, if we didn't know what we didn't know, and we were going to Everest and we knew it was going to be minus 40 degrees at altitude, plus wind chill of free fall, we may have elected to take this type of jumpsuit configuration, a full underlayer of down jacket and pants, plus another heavy duty jumpsuit. But the reality was, based on the extreme conditions of Nepal, this would have been too much. We would have overheated, we would have been uncomfortable. It would not have been as successful of a program if we had elected to use this type of suit. But by the same contrast, as we headed into our balloon high altitude project, our initial thought was, well, we'll just use our Everest suits. We've used them in Nepal, we've used them on the North Pole, we've used them in Antarctica. Never were we faced with that length of a duration of cold in the balloon that we would face in that one environment. So that's why we elected to go with this higher caliber suit for that colder conditioned environment. And on this balloon jump, we also had battery powered underwear. This was the only time in my skydiving career that I actually decided I was going to take heated underwear with me, heated socks, heated pants, heated shirt, all form-fitting, what we would call an underlayer. I'm not sure how you would describe that. It's a cotton fit, form-fitting, light, thin layer. And the interesting part about the heated packs is that, of course, they require batteries that, one, have to be charged, but two, you're actually walking around wearing these batteries while they're plugged in and working. So that was kind of an interesting experience. We had never jumped with heated underwear or battery packs heating the underwear before. And you always kind of wonder what happens if something catches fire, but thankfully they do enough testing on the stuff that we didn't have that to worry about that. So going back to gloves, if you see in the center, there's two different gloves. There's what your traditional skydiving winter gloves, the Newmans. Those come in thin summer material and then a thick winter material. And I've always jumped with Newman winter gloves in winter conditions and never had any real problems with them until we started going to places like the North Pole and Antarctica, where the extended cold on the ground, in the aircraft, and operating became more problematic for comfort, yet function was still critical. So I did some research and I found this company called ProLine. That's the glove to the right where you see the words Pro on the bottom of the gloves. And by themselves, neither the Newman winter glove Tactified nor the ProLine what they call Floprene, neither one of them by themselves are great for really cold weather. However, if you put the two of them together, you have an exceptional glove combination that gives you tactile feel allows you to get RSLs if needed, hackies, drogues, whatever you need to work with your fingers. And so that's become my go-to standard for extreme cold conditions, a Proline glove inside of a Newman Winter Tactified glove. And for cost comparisons, US dollars, the Prolines run about $50 for the pair, as does the Newmans run about $40. So for under $100 US, I was able to get a really efficient pair of cold weather gloves that have served me well for years in these remote locations. Now, you'll also notice that I have two pairs of them, two sets, if you will. One of the critical components of extreme skydiving, I call it the Noah's Ark effect. Always bring two of everything. You're going to lose things, they're going to break, they're going to get damaged. So whenever possible and wherever possible, always have two of everything you need in extreme remote locations and extreme remote conditions. So I have two sets of gloves in case something gets damaged on one or lost. I have a backup set, and I'm not worrying or scrambling trying to find an alternative. Same holds true for altimeters. Always bring multiple altimeters with you. Multiple sets of batteries for the altimeters, because especially in cold weather, the batteries tend to go faster. Interestingly enough, this Aries here, this is rated up to 40,000 feet and I believe well below minus 40 degrees. It's an LMB Aries, well below any of the temperatures we could possibly expose them to. So as you go into extreme conditions, one of the brainstorming things we ask ourselves is, are we taking our equipment past its intended operating parameters? It could be an altimeter, it could be an AED. All of today's modern AEDs, the Vigil Quattro, the Cypress 2, they're all tested, tried and true to these altitudes, but whenever possible, the military versions of these units are tested and certified to even greater conditions. So we attempt to get military AEDs from time to time, depending upon the projects we're working on. And then the last item to address here in the slide, knee pads. Any of you that are tunnel instructors are probably familiar with these knee pads and elbow pads from bouncing around the tunnel. They make for great additional safety benefit when you're landing in uneven terrain, like for us, Nepal, with all the rocks and pebbles. While we always expect a stand-up landing, you never know if someone's gonna slip or fall. So having knee pads and elbow pads protecting your joints in these extreme conditions is just one more layer of protection. On the left, we have batteries. The top silver battery, that's actually a backup for my laptop. I'm not an IT person, but I have a great IT director at the company, and he provided me with a backup battery for my laptop so that when I'm in these cold locations, if I'm losing battery, I can actually recharge my laptop in these conditions. Same holds true for recharging GoPros, recharging cameras. Anker, A-N-K-E-R, is a brand that I use. They have heavy duty external batteries. I always have two battery packs for travel purposes, and on certain locations we'll bring 3 or 4 battery packs, because we never know how the cold is going to affect the battery life. Multiple GoPros, multiple sets of goggles, everything, at least 2 of everything. And here a 1 terabyte external hard drive to download media so that we have a backup in case something happens to the laptop. Interestingly enough, in really cold conditions, the laptops don't work. The batteries essentially stop producing power. It's beyond my pay grade to explain why. I don't understand electronics that well, but in very cold conditions, hard drives have been known to get damaged and sometimes even unrecoverable, and batteries stop working in incredibly low conditions as well. Next key item is your rigging kit. If you're going to go anywhere off the map, anywhere off the radar, expect to have a cutaway. Ask yourself, if we have a cutaway, are we able to repack it? And there might be instances where you don't and you can't do that, and it's a calculated risk. You hope you're not going to have a cutaway. But if you're going to spend any extended period of time in a location operating a drop zone, as we do in these locations, we have to have our resources to be able to repack reserves. No one ever drops their handles, but just in case, I have extra handles, 2 sets, pilot chutes, a mobile rigging kit. Everything I need to repack a reserve is in this little rigging kit. I've got a plate to close it. I've got my packing paddles, extra rubber bands. And in the real world, we use duct tape. They say there's something like 1,000,001 uses for duct tape. In skydiving, we have gaffer's tape. There's 1,000,001 skydiving uses for gaffer's tape. So always make sure you bring gaffer's tape with you on these extreme expeditions. And this is the holy grail of extreme condition skydiving equipment. It's a spare reserve pilot chute and free bag. That's the one thing that's going to get lost if you have a cutaway. And while cutaways are rare, they do happen. And having an extra one available in case you've lost it could mean the difference between continuing on with your extreme expedition or having to call it and stop your skydiving because you don't have spare parts with you. A toolkit, Allen keys to be able to remove helmet lenses, to be able to tighten GoPro mounts, etc. Knives, screwdrivers. Are you able to fix anything and everything and repair the things that you travel with? That's what the toolkit is for. And then now, especially with COVID-19, we're extra hyper-focused on germs. I never travel without Lysol disinfectant wipes, especially for our oxygen masks that we use. But it's always good to have disinfectant wipes around you when you're working in remote locations. All right, so this brings us to aircraft considerations. I'm going to pause this again and go back to another quick video. Lessons learned with aircraft considerations. There's Bill Booth, my boss. Pause this here for a moment. This is downtown Cairo, highly dense, highly populated, not a lot of outs there. And of course, here's the Giza Plateau where we're all intending to land below the pyramids. All right, so when you think about extreme condition skydiving, for the most part, I would think of it as the things that I've already described. You're jumping in extreme cold, you're jumping in snow, high altitudes, far off the map locations, distant places hard to get to. And then you create a skydiving program in Egypt. And we were blessed to be invited to this trip a couple years ago. And for most skydivers, myself included, we wouldn't necessarily consider this to be an extreme skydiving situation, but it really is. And one of the things that I pointed out by pausing the video was that the densely populated city beside the pyramids. The other item of note in the video was the aircraft that we were jumping out of. Hercules C-130. And for any of you that have jumped out of these large cargo aircraft, they have an incredibly fast exit speed. I want to say about 130 to 140 knots. In many instances, you're actually slowing down to free fall terminal velocity when you're leaving these large aircraft as they're barreling across the sky. Now, as you're sitting there thinking through this, ask yourself, have you ever spotted a C-130? Do you know anyone that's spotted a C-130? And most of us would say, probably not, unless you have friends in the military that are also jumpers or jump masters or military skydivers, or big way organizers that have been skydiving with 20, 30 years experience that have helped set some of the large world records in skydiving, large aircraft formation world records. Most skydivers are not able to accurately spot a C-130. And I'll admit to you, at one point in my career, I could have done it. Right now, I am not current on spotting at that speed, at that type of aircraft. I wouldn't be able to safely spot a C-130. The organizers that we worked with, however, they were aware of this. Two young, smart skydivers, Mahmoud and Mustafa, they organized the Jump Like a Pharaoh expedition, it's still going on now. They did one of the most brilliant things an organizer should do. They brought in someone who had experience spotting this aircraft. Any of you know the name Herman Landsman? He's been around skydiving for 30 plus years, highly regarded, highly successful, highly intelligent, highly competent individual. And he put the aircraft over the Giza Plateau, and everyone on that load, all 80 people, landed at the site in between the pyramids. 6 months, year and a half later, there were other events happening, and this is in no way, shape, or form intended to be derogatory towards anyone. It's simply, these are the things we learn as skydivers. One of the other expeditions, and there's multiple of them, one of them, I'm not even sure which one, had an entire load of C-130 participants land off in downtown Cairo because of a spotting problem. And when we think about extreme problems in skydiving or extreme conditions, none of us, myself included, until you learn it from it, would think, is spotting really that extreme? Well, in certain instances it is. So thankfully, the good news is nobody got hurt on that load that everybody landed off, but I can assure you, if you got injured skydiving on an expedition, being in downtown Cairo, hanging off of a building from a parachute would be one of the last locations you'd want to try to get emergency evac services at that point. So thankfully, no one got hurt, but it was something as an industry and as a collective skydiving community we were able to learn from. Make sure that you assess all of the extreme conditions that you're subjecting yourself to, including that of the aircraft. Okay, close that out, go back to sorry, apologize. Give me one moment. Home, slideshow. Nope. There it is. So here we are, aircraft considerations. Anytime you find yourself on an extreme condition skydiving program, always ask questions ahead of time. What aircraft are we using? What type of configuration is the aircraft? Is it side door? Is it tailgate? What's the airspeed on exit? Airspeed on exit, whether it's high and fast like a C-130 going 130 knots, or slow like a 40 knot forward speed of a Eurocopter B3 here. When we exit in airspeeds we're not used to, high or low, we tend to find ourselves swimming at low speed exits and in high speed airspeed becoming projectiles towards our friends. So making sure we understand the dynamics, the extreme dynamics of these different airspeed configurations will help ensure your safety in these types of programs. How much experience do you have with that aircraft? And if you don't have experience, always ask before getting on it. Ask someone like Herman, ask an experienced load organizer, ask someone for tips and tricks to get out of it safely. Does the aircraft meet your needs? If it's a halo jump, what's the oxygen configuration on board and for bailout? And ultimately, what is your pilot's experience? Helicopter skydiving, I think, is one of the coolest and most accessible things that we have in extreme skydiving, or just in skydiving in general. That being said, there are good helicopters to use for skydiving, and there are not so good helicopters to use for skydiving. And if you're asking yourself which one is which, that's a good thing, because we're sitting in a quarantine situation. No one's jumping out of them right now. If you're not sure which helicopters are good for skydiving and which ones aren't, then I would encourage you to do some research on the process, research on the topic. I'll give you the short version. I'm only a fixed wing pilot. I am not a rotor wing, so I can't speak with authority as a pilot, but a helicopter pilot. But I do know that helicopters such as the Eurocopter Airbus B3 here, it is a fixed mast helicopter. The actual mast that the rotors are spinning from is fixed and attached to the fuselage. There are other helicopters like the Bell helicopter series, the Jet Ranger, that has a floating mast. The mast is allowed to move inside of the fuselage, and it allows for performance dynamics of the aircraft to be efficient in certain ways. When skydivers exit aircraft, they change the center of gravity of the helicopter. And so with a fixed mast helicopter like the B3, which is exceptional, it doesn't matter what the CG load shift is within our skydiving abilities, a couple 100 pounds either way. It has a nominal effect on the structure of the aircraft. Whereas with floating mast helicopters like Jet Rangers, the floating mast of the helicopter while it's spinning, as CG shifts change, the fuselage basically swings underneath it in very small little gyrations, and that can cause stress fractures in the mast, and the worst case scenario, the propellers can actually separate from the helicopter. Now, skilled pilots can fly that Jet Ranger with no problem and drop jumpers. That's why we have jumpers leave from both sides. They have some kind of technique in terms of forward speed descents to keep pressure on the mast while skydiving operation is happening. If you ever find yourself jumping out of a Jet Ranger, or any helicopter for that matter, ask the pilot, is this fixed or floating mast helicopter? And if it's a floating mast helicopter, do they know how to drop jumpers out of it without fracturing or damaging the mast? They may say they have no idea, and they could make a phone call to another pilot, and that could save everyone's life. So just little things like that that you pick up along the way, things that we learn over time. Who would think that the aircraft has much to do with the extreme conditions, but it really can have an effect and make a difference in the process. Where am I landing? That's probably my #1 question in skydiving. I kiddingly tell people I've made a career out of landing off. I could never find the drop zone as a student, so I figured I might as well just turn that into a career rather than try to learn to land where I'm supposed to. Wherever we land, North Pole, Antarctica, the pyramids of Giza, the plateau of the pyramids, Everest, Himalaya, on the sandy beaches of South Africa, landing below great white sharks that are in the water beside you. Always knowing what your drop zone size is, and if it's a remote location, your access and ability to get there prior to landing on it. That's probably, it sounds silly, but that's probably one of the most unique attributes of remote skydiving. You don't always get a chance to see your landing area before you take off. In certain instances, you might take off from one location, land somewhere that you've never seen before. So if it's a remote drop zone, you've never seen it before, getting as much data as you can about it is incredibly helpful. And in today's modern era, we have Google Earth, tremendous amount of GPS information in locations anywhere around the world. So make sure you know where you're landing, what its elevation is, how that's going to affect your canopy performance. Predominant winds, there's wind forecasting websites out there you can look at, and are you near water? And if you're near water, or in the case of Belize, the Blue Hole, if you're landing in water, do you have flotation devices? This is my teammate Ryan Jackson. He's an emergency room doctor when he's not a skydiving doctor and a skydiver. It's always important to ask yourself whether you're bringing a doctor on board with you or if you have one. And in Australia, you guys have one of the most qualified, exceptional, extraordinary skydiving doctors on and above the planet, and Glenn Singleman. I've worked with him in Antarctica, and we're going to work with him in Nepal moving forward. Having people like that in your operational plan, whether it's Dr. Jackson or Glenn, Dr. Singelman, having an appropriate medical plan that is acceptable to the conditions you're operating in. Making sure you have a pre-plan alert. What is the blood type of the people that you're working with and skydiving with? If someone gets injured and you don't know their blood type and they can't communicate it, that could slow a process down. Allergies, who to contact in case of an emergency, and most importantly, what is the emergency evac plan? And for example, in Antarctica, we don't have one. You could be spent 3, 4, 5 days, 8 days. The last time, or the first time we were there, we were stuck for 8 days before the conditions were suitable for the Aleutian to come back in for a resupply and pick people up. So if someone had gotten injured and there's no evacuation plan, what do you do? Well, our risk mitigation was we had an extraordinary doctor with us in Glenn, and emergency room doctor who could perform whatever needed to be performed there at the medical station in Antarctica. And having that in lieu of an evacuation made the risk acceptable for us to go down there and skydiving. But just asking yourself, what is the evacuation plan? And if there isn't one, do you have a risk mitigation against it that will allow you to keep any injured parties stable and in good health until they can be evacuated? And in capturing your media, a lot of this, and I think the videos speak better than the PowerPoint presentation, it's really important to get good video, get good photos. But one of the things we found over the years is batteries die. So making sure that whatever cameras you're using, whether they're SLRs, whether they're GoPro 8s, 9s, 10s, or 11s, do you have adequate battery life for the conditions you're using them in? Do you have charging stations if you need them? Here we're in a little village called Pokhara. We had one outlet for every one of our cameras. So I started bringing power banks with me so we could charge more cameras with the external batteries. Do you have backup helmets? One year we lost a helmet on a hard opening from one of our videographers. He had a backup helmet, went right back to work. And in some locations, SD cards, even though they're all now static, they're no moving parts, they still don't like cold weather. So making sure you have an extreme version of your SD cards only serves to help improve the probability that you're not going to lose or damage your media. So in conclusion, whenever you're skydiving, but especially when you're entering into an extreme location, extreme conditions, expect the best, but always plan for the worst. I probably spend more time thinking about what can go wrong than what can go right whenever I look at going into a extreme condition skydiving program. Extreme conditions require extreme planning. Ask yourself, with whatever new parameters you're setting, whether it's jumpsuits, gloves, goggles, helmets, can you still perform? Are you taking away your ability to perform as a skydiver by putting too many layers on? Gloves that are mittens that prevent you from being able to access your handles. And whenever possible, test it on the ground in controlled environments. If you're really hot or really cold, will it affect how you're able to perform and function? And for me, what's been most valuable is finding a mentor. Accidental mentors in our sport are everywhere. You meet someone, they want to share information with you, and learning from others, I think, is the most critical component of any skydiving expedition, especially one in an extreme nature. I've mentioned names like Wendy Smith, like Glenn Singelman, like Herman Landsman, Derek Thomas. Any of you are familiar with Derek? He was part of SunPath for the longest time. He's another international skydiving experienced person. The people that we work with that have gone and done this stuff before us are the best sources of information. And I want to end this conclusion with, there's a story about Antarctica that is relevant to what we're discussing here. And there were a group of skydivers that went down to Antarctica in the late 1990s. And I apologize, it was either 1997 or 1998. There were four solo skydivers and a tandem at a minimum. There may have been one or two more on that jump. And they actually jumped on the South Pole. They took off from a Twin Otter and they climbed to approximately 13,000 feet above the South Pole. It might have been 9,000 or 11,000 feet, but the pole excuse me, was elevated 9,000 feet above sea level. So they were really at 18,000, 19,000 feet. They were at a high enough altitude that they should have been wearing onboard oxygen. And arguably they should have had bailout oxygen at those altitudes. And the tandem, I believe, accepted the offer for oxygen in the aircraft, but most of the skydivers and the solo jumpers did not. And it was one of the worst tragedies in skydiving. We had a four-way of skydivers, of solo jumpers. 3 of them went in and died on Christmas Day on the South Pole in 1997 or 1998, went right through the snow. They were hypoxic. Everything was white. They weren't making good decisions. Now, the surviving member of that four-way is a gentleman named Michael Kearns, extraordinary human being. I've spoke with him at length about this. He's actually written an article about it, about all the pitfalls that occurred as a case study that allowed for that to happen. So when I say find a mentor, even just having conversations with him and learning from his past successes and the issues that their expedition suffered that led to the 3 people getting killed on that jump have been invaluable, and not just in learning and knowledge, but also reminding ourselves that just because we're able to accomplish something doesn't mean that it was easy or that it was something that we should take lightly. Working with some of the best in the world at what they do, we have the opportunity to create programs that are sustainable, but still dangerous. And sometimes when we make sustainable programs, we think because they are sustainable that they're not that dangerous. And if I had to take any level of pride in what we do, we've been running Ever Skydive since 2008. I've been in charge of it since 2012. No one's been injured since we've been up there and running the program since 2009, Wendy and myself, and since I've been responsible for it. The reason why I believe we haven't injured anyone is because we've never lost focus on how dangerous it is what we do. Despite our successes, it's still one of the most dangerous things in the world we do, skydiving, and never forgetting that, never letting your successes give you an overinflated sense of confidence that we've done something successfully for 10 years and taking a step back and not being as vigilant. And last but not least, share your successes. When Charles invited me to talk to you guys tonight, I was thrilled about the opportunity, and I do apologize. This is my first time speaking on Zoom. Normally I'm standing upright, being able to walk around and engage the eyes of the people I'm working with. So if I wasn't a smooth transition speaker, I apologize for that. I'm not used to sitting at a desk giving a presentation like this. I'm used to being in a room in an active, dynamic environment. But when Charles invited me to speak with you, I was thrilled about the idea, because my hope was I would inspire or motivate one of you or all of you to go find your own extreme condition skydiving expeditions, to go do things outside the box, find the different part of skydiving that's yours to create and give to the world. The thing that I'm most proud of, if anything, in the last 20 years of doing this, is that I've been able to share my experiences and share my my skydiving with friends new and old. And I've got friends around the world now as a result of it, and they've done the same for me. They've opened up extreme skydiving opportunities for me. I've opened them up for them. So I hope that I've motivated some of you to look into this. And when you create your extreme condition skydiving, I'm available to you 24/7 for mentorship, consultation, question and answer, anything I can do to help you, I'm here for. And hopefully I'll be able to be one of your guests and share your jump with you and participate with you. So the world is yours. I hope you guys got some benefit from this. I'm going to end with one last video. It's a 3-minute video on Antarctica. I started with the North Pole. I'm going to end with the South Pole. And then I'll be happy to stay online and answer any questions you guys have. So let me end the slideshow. Go to my last video that I'm going to show here. Here it is. So the most important thing about any skydive, especially expedition skydiving, is returning home safely. That should be your primary number one goal. Bring everybody back with you safe and in one piece. Try to have some fun along the way and see the world in extraordinary and extreme conditions whenever you can. That's my advice. I'm happy to answer any questions for you guys. I hope the time was of some value for you. And yeah, Wade, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Tom. That was unbelievable. Very, very good. Amazing.
Thank you.
You're very fortunate to have experienced all this different stuff. Amazing stuff.
Okay.
Cool. I've got a question for you, Tom. We had Dan BC on a while ago, and the question was asked to Dan. What are your 3 most memorable jumps, and where are your 3 most favorite places to jump?
Okay, that's great questions. My 3 most memorable jumps. So obviously the first time I jumped in Nepal with Mount Everest, that was something that I couldn't have even begun to frame in my mind what it was going to look like. We didn't know where we were landing, whether it was going to be on Everest Base Camp, somewhere on the mountain. It had never been done before. It was the first time that a civilian halo system had been merged with sports skydiving systems. Up until this point, it was really the realm of military use for halo systems. So we had a completely purpose-built civilian halo system. We had a Pilatus Porter flown in from Switzerland, and it was just this hodgepodge of extraordinary people that had all met each other for the first time, really. And we didn't know, none of us had ever been to the region before, so we didn't know what the backdrop of Mount Everest was going to look like. And our pilot flew us within about a half nautical mile of the south face of Mount Everest on our jump run. And we opened the door of the porter and just staring out across the wingtip and seeing the peak of Mount Everest, which is just, it's an awesome force of nature. And that's what we first really understood it as. We've come to appreciate it for the goddess that she is over the last 10 years and how she's worshipped by the locals and how she protects the region. But that moment of sitting on the side of the porter for the first time, not even exiting the aircraft, just the jump run, flying at 29,000 feet, looking out at Mount Everest across the horizon almost within reach. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have found skydiving. It opened up a world to me that I never thought possible. And then, of course, exiting the aircraft and falling beside Mount Everest is probably the most memorable moment of my skydiving career. The second one would have to be jumping onto the North Pole. If the Everest expedition was a marathon, we spent a month on the mountain that first year, and we had to walk for 4 days to acclimatize to even get to our landing area at 13,000 feet. By contrast, the North Pole, I flew from Daytona Beach, Florida to New York City, from New York City to Amsterdam, Amsterdam to Norway, Norway to Spitsbergen, Sweden, or Longyearbyen is the airport, LYR. And all of that was accomplished in, say, 18 hours or so. The following morning, got on an airplane for I want to say it was a Antonov AN-72 or 74, got onto a cargo Antonov AN-72, and within 2.5 hours, we landed at Ice Base Borneo. As I stepped off the plane onto the ice pack, you feel even though it's 2 meters thick, you kind of feel the wobble of the ice, floating in the ocean. And our organizer, my friend Sasha, he walked up to me and he said, "Can you make a 45-minute call? The weather conditions are perfect. We have a Russian Mi-8 helicopter going out to the North Pole. And if you and Jim, your teammate, can be ready in 45 minutes, we can assure you will jump on this trip. We're not sure what the weather's going to be like for the next few days." So, as I mentioned earlier, you don't necessarily know where you're going to jump. We got ourselves together. The North Pole, interestingly enough, and I learned as I went, I was never really strong with geography growing up. It's not actual landmass. It's an ice pack that floats on the ocean. So the pole is always moving. They call it negative drift. It moves away. The ice pack slides and drifts in the ocean. So the North Pole today will not be the North Pole tomorrow. It'll drift about 45 meters from day to day, depending upon the currents and how big the ice pack is. So we actually had to go fly and find the North Pole at that moment. So we flew at about 500 feet off the ground in that Russian Mi-8 helicopter, and the pilots found what was the North Pole at that very moment. We landed on it. They put out a smoke marker, and we left 2 ground crew to take photos. And then we took off, just circled until we got to 12,000 feet. And if the topography of Nepal was jagged rock, awesome force of nature, the North Pole was a complete whiteout. There was nothing. There was no depth perception. It was a sheet of ice in every direction for as far as the eye could see. There was 30 feet looked like 3,000 feet. Snowdrifts that you thought were 30 meters high were really only 1 meter high. There was no visual depth perception other than the 2 people we had left on the ground. And even the smoke, I've landed using smoke for the wind drift direction probably 30 times in my life. Never understood what the depth perception of the smoke was until the humans standing beside it with no contrast behind it. The 2 people on the ground looked like ants until about 10 feet off the ground. So exiting the North Pole, knowing that everywhere we looked was a southern view, that literally everywhere on Earth there was humanity, was south of us in every direction. Exiting that aircraft in that capacity and being successful, having done the due diligence we could do to have a successful landing on the North Pole. Those 2 jumps contrast each other so much, from Mount Everest to the North Pole, that those 2 will always stay with me as the 2 of the most extraordinary jumps I've ever made, that I look back on with fondness. And my third one, the Whitsundays. Back in 2000, I think it's Whitehaven Beach. Back in 2008 or 9, I forget exactly which year it was, but I was working for Performance Designs at the time. And it was the first year that the APF had invited me down to tour and speak. And I went to Ailey Beach, and I had met one of my friends, Phil Gordon, who I'd worked with Alex, and Phil and I had all worked at Endzone together. So I see Alex is here on the broadcast here. Phil was working at Ailey Beach, and I spoke to the instructors like I do at the other drop zones. And then Johnny Goss, who I'd met for the first time, said to me, "Tom, we'd like to take you on a special skydive. We're going to jump onto the beach." And I've made beach jumps before, so I tried to play it cool. But here I am in Australia for the first time, making a beach jump, which was actually my first jump in Australia. And we jumped into the 206. And she said, "We're going to fly to the beach. We're going to get out, jump, and then we have to take a boat back. There's no roads back from where we're going." And so I'd never seen that part of the world before, never seen that type of beach, that type of landscape. And getting out of the 206 with Johnny and Phil and jumping, we ended up building like a 4 or 5 or 6 way because we had others join us. And then landing on the beach, no idea what the wind direction was, because there was nobody there. We had jumped onto the beach, there was no ground crew waiting for us. Everybody had perfect stand-up landings. And the comical part of it, why I look back on it so fondly, is that I had just put a brand new parachute in my my container system. I'd put a Velocity, Comp Velocity 96. And, I did my 4-line check. I did all this, I'm a rigger. I attached this brand new, at the time, $3,000 main parachute, put it in my container, packed everything in my bag, and out we went. And my first thought when I threw my pilot chute was, I hope I hooked it up straight, because if I cut this canopy away, it's going to drift to Los Angeles. It's going to go out in the ocean. I'm never going to see it again. And it opened perfect. And we had a great landing, and a boat had come out with a cricket set. I learned how to play cricket. I made a skydive onto one of the most beautiful locations on Earth in Whitehaven Beach. And fast forward 10 years later, as part of my 7 Tandem 7 Continent project, my teammate said, "Where are we going to jump in Oceania?" And I said, "There's only one place we can go. We have to make it special. It's got to be Whitehaven Beach." So again, Phil Onus, Johnny Goss, Charles Richard McCooey, everybody in my APF family put that jump together again. So I actually got a chance to make one of my favorite jumps twice. The Whitehaven Beach, I did it as a solo jumper in 2009 or 10, and then again this last year on the tandem jump. And to wrap that story up, I was at the APF conference in the Gold Coast a couple of years ago, and Johnny walked up to me and she handed me a bag and she said, "I have a present for you." I opened up the bag and there's a staff shirt from Skydive Ailey Beach with my name on it. And the picture of this dye sublimated shirt is our 5-way over Whitehaven Beach. So I wear that when I fly my little Cessna. It's my pilot shirt. So just that whole story behind it and the experience of jumping onto Whitehaven, the stand was so fine, our feet were squeaking. That was my third most favorite jump that I've ever made. Those three are my big three. And what was the other question? Those are my three favorite
places to jump. So I guess you kind of answered them.
Yep. A quick three other places that would be favorite. Jumping over the Palm in Dubai is obviously amazing. Jumping in Antarctica is a natural resource that we're so blessed to be able to operate around. And Skydive Sebastian here in the United States. It's just, I've been jumping there on and off for almost 20 years. It's an intercoastal waterway over the ocean, similar to coastal jumping in Australia. I always enjoy jumping at Skydive Sebastian over the ocean.
Cool. Yep. That's a great place to jump.
Yep.
Robbo's written a question. Robbo's from Skydive Elderslie. He's got a question about Central Australia. Are you familiar with what Uluru is? Have you heard of that, Tom?
Say Rotorua?
No, Uluru. Rotorua is in New Zealand.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. No, Uluru. I have not heard of that.
Ayers Rock. It's the biggest rock.
Ayers Rock.
Yeah.
Yes, we tried to put a jump together there a couple of years ago as part of another 7-continent, 7-day trip around the world. But unfortunately, the trip never ended up materializing. They wanted to do it in 7 days, and it was just too much. The logistics of trying to get 12 people on 7 continents in 7 days was too much. But yes, I've always wanted to jump at Ayers Rock.
Yeah. You got something else, Robbo? Maybe.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Robbo.
Tom, I'm interested in doing it. I think there's a drop zone at Alice Springs, and I think they jump out at Uluru, but I'm pretty sure we could get a 4-day camp there and do some jumps. I don't know if anybody else is interested in Australia, or if you want to, Tom.
Absolutely. And once the COVID-19 calms down, I'm reasonably sure that my employer, Mr. Bill Booth, would probably be interested in coming down with me to make that jump. He is, if you're familiar with Indiana Jones, the movies, Bill Booth is basically the skydiving version of Indiana Jones. He's, for every cool thing I've done, he's done 10 times that, and he loves these kind of extraordinary skydives. So I would certainly be interested in getting together with you and trying to connect and make something like that happen. And
okay.
A few other people I'm sure would be happy to come with us.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll be in touch on that.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Robbo. Anyone got another question? I've got heaps of questions that could sit here and talk all day. Tom, what kind of approvals did you get or you need in Nepal from different authorities? How did that work?
Well, Nepal doesn't have any skydiving operational manuals. There's a lot of countries around the world that don't even have their own dedicated what you would call civil aviation authority. For us, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority. So a lot of countries like that will just basically rubber stamp what the US FAA has done. They'll basically erase FAA and put Nepal Civil Aviation Authority in front of it because the framework's already written. So we operated, and then actually I believe in the case of Nepal, I think they actually fell under the British aviation regulations because of the Brits have such a a large presence there. I could be wrong, but the aviation itself, we were basically left to write our own operating manual. And many, many years ago, Wendy and myself, along with our helicopter and aircraft companies that we were working with, wrote operational manuals for those processes. So effectively, we mirrored, from my perspective, on my side, USPA's requirements and UPT's requirements for tandem, and I believe Wendy used the APF as the framework, or the NZPIA rather, excuse me, as the framework for the sports skydiving operations side of it back in 2008. So everyone's required to have licenses. Tandem instructors are required to follow the same procedures with medicals and have currencies and ratings. And for example, a Sigma rated instructor wouldn't jump a strong tandem system out there. A strong rated instructor wouldn't jump a Sigma system out there. They have to have the competencies on the equipment, just like they would anywhere else in the world. They'd have to have the ratings and the competencies.
Yeah. How about landowners and stuff like that, like the airstrip?
Oh, we're jumping in a national park, so there are no landowners to necessarily receive approval from, and we are jumping on an old airstrip. The Sangboche Airfield used to be a supply depot for single-engine fixed-wing Pilatus Porter supply missions, and it's still used with Mi-17s, I believe. That's the big one. There's a big Russian helicopter there that still flies in supplies to that same location a couple of times a week. Our permissions, though, really come from our friends in Nepal, the locals that live at the mountains, the Chamber of Commerce. If the cafe owners, if the tea house owners, if the sporting goods store owners, if they didn't want us flying parachutes over their skyline, they would not give us permission to be there. And in large part, the reason we're still there 12, 13 years later is because we've become so ingrained in the community there. They're lifelong friends of ours now that live up there, and Everest Skydive has become part of that landscape. And then on a national level, we request sensitivity permits from the Ministry of Tourism each year, which are basically contributions to the tourism industry to help offset our carbon footprint, if you will. We make a donation of certain dollar amount, whatever it is per year, towards the usage fee, if you will, of the Himalayas. And so it kind of offsets us being there and flying aircraft in there.
Okay, and is that similar in the South Pole? How does it work down there?
Well, in Antarctica is actually an interesting dynamic of its own. There's no national governing body in Antarctica, but if there were, it'd be Chile. For the most part, the Chilean government and Chilean Air Force are the present government presence, if there is one. We operate out of Chile. We fly from Punta Arenas into Antarctica. And the actual company we work with, however, Antarctic Logistics and Expeditions, it's a company owned by a partnership. Multiple partners are Australian. There's English and US partners, I believe, as well. So it's an international conglomerate. But the Union Glacier camp, where we operate out of, essentially is a small city that they have established operating procedures in conjunction with Chilean Air Force and Chilean government, in conjunction with the Argentinian government, to abide by whatever sensitivities that their impact is going to create. But ultimately, it's an international no man's land. So there, every time I've been there, someone has asked the question of what international law do you follow down there? Right. But no, I can't remember what the answer is. Whether it's Australia, New Zealand, Chile, Argentina, the US, I mean, everyone has a presence there, Russia. But whatever the international treaties are that have been set up to protect the landmass also include whatever the governance is of the location.
Yeah, right. That's interesting stuff.
Yeah.
All right. Has anyone got any other questions? No other questions? All right. We might wrap it up there. We've gone about 40 minutes over time, but that's fine. Tom, thank you so much. We are going to see you again next week, I believe.
Yes.
With further talks. Yep. So everyone watch out for that. If nobody has any further questions, well, I'll bid you adieu. Thanks for coming. Stay safe, stay happy, and wash your hands.